If Britain's economy had maintained the growth rate it enjoyed before the 2008 financial crisis, the average person today would be around £11,000 better off. Instead, the country has spent the last 15 years falling short of its own expectations. Economic growth has remained weak. Living standards have stagnated, and each year the gap between where Britain is and where it could have been has grown a little wider. Today, Britain's economic output per person is only slightly higher than that of Mississippi, America's poorest state. Now, that might not sound like a huge deal. After all, Britain is still one of the largest economies in the world. London remains one of the world's most important financial centres. Its universities attract talent from across the globe. And millions of people still see Britain as a wealthy, successful country. But its economic growth has slowed. Wages have barely moved. Public services are under pressure. Young people are finding it harder than ever to buy a home. And every few years, a new government arrives promising to turn things around. Britain isn't in a depression or its economy hasn't collapsed. Instead, the country has become trapped in something arguably more dangerous: stagnation. The strange part is that nobody can seem to agree on what's actually causing it. Some blame Brexit, others blame austerity, some point to immigration, others point to housing, productivity, or government incompetence. And while all of those explanations contain some truth, none of them fully explain why Britain has spent more than 15 years struggling to regain the growth it once enjoyed. Because Britain's problem isn't one bad policy or one bad government. It's a web of problems that feed into one another. A cycle that has quietly trapped one of the world's most advanced economies in a state of permanent stagnation. So what exactly went wrong? Why did Britain's economy stop getting richer? And perhaps more importantly, why has it become so difficult to fix? Between the early 1970s and the 2008 financial crisis, Britain's economy expanded almost continuously. Each year, businesses became a little more productive. Workers earned a little more money. Living standards gradually improved, and each generation could reasonably expect to be better off than the one before it. Then came 2008. Like most developed economies, Britain's economy was hit hard by the global financial crisis. The economy entered its deepest recession in decades. At the time, many economists believed the damage would be temporary. After all, recessions happen. Economies recover, and eventually growth returns. Except this time, it didn't, at least not in the way many expected. Britain returned to growth on paper. People went back to work. Businesses reopened. The economy stabilized. But something fundamental had changed. The years after 2008 looked very different from the decades that came before it. Instead of rapidly catching up to its old trend, Britain's economy began moving sideways. Growth became weaker, and wage growth almost disappeared. In fact, by some measures, the average British worker was earning less in real terms in the early 2020s than before the financial crisis. That is an extraordinary outcome for a developed economy, especially one that was once considered among the most successful in Europe. And this wasn't just a British problem. Many advanced economies struggled after 2008. But while countries like the United States eventually regained much of their momentum, Britain remained stuck. So, why wasn't Britain getting richer anymore? The answer starts with the deceptively simple concept that economists obsess over productivity, and without it, long-term prosperity becomes almost impossible. Economists disagree on a lot of things. They argue about taxes, trade, government spending, immigration, and just about everything else you can imagine. But there is one thing almost all of them agree on. In the long run, the most important driver of prosperity is productivity. Now, productivity might sound like one of those boring economic buzzwords that gets thrown around by politicians and never properly explained. It's about producing more with the same amount of effort. And over time, productivity is what allows wages to rise. It's what allows businesses to become more profitable. And ultimately, it's what allows countries to get richer. For most of modern British history, this process worked remarkably well. Between the 1970s to 2008, British productivity roughly doubled. But over the next 15 years, productivity growth barely moved. In fact, Britain's productivity increased by only around 5% during a period, when previous generations had become dramatically more productive. To put that into perspective, productivity growth that once took place over a few years now took more than a decade. Today, the average British worker produces significantly less economic output per hour than the average American worker. The gap is roughly equivalent to nearly an entire extra working day every week. That might sound like a problem only economists care about, but its consequences show up everywhere. When productivity stagnates, wages stagnate, and living standards stop improving. So, what changed after 2008? The answer lies in something Britain has struggled with for decades: investment. For decades, the UK has invested less than almost every other major economy. In fact, Britain has had one of the lowest investment rates in the G7 for most of the last years. While countries like Germany, Japan, and even France consistently poured money into factories, equipment, infrastructure, and new technologies, and Britain's investment problem became much worse after 2008. In response to the financial crisis, the government launched a prolonged period of austerity. While austerity may have helped limit government borrowing, it also reduced public investment. Infrastructure projects were delayed, public services faced spending constraints, and many of the long-term investments that help economies become more productive were pushed into the future. Then came another shock: Brexit. Regardless of whether you support Brexit or oppose it, one thing is difficult to dispute. Businesses hate uncertainty, and between the 2016 referendum and Britain's eventual departure from the European Union, uncertainty was everywhere. Companies didn't know what future trading arrangements would look like. They didn't know how regulations would change. They didn't know whether supply chains would be disrupted. So many businesses did what businesses often do during uncertain times. The result was that Britain entered the 2020s facing a problem that had been building for years. But this creates another question. Because if Britain clearly needs more investment, why doesn't it simply invest more? To understand this, we need to talk about one of the most powerful institutions in the country. Every country has a finance ministry. Their job is usually straightforward: collect taxes, manage spending, and make sure the government doesn't run out of money. But Britain's treasury is different. For decades, it has operated according to a fairly simple philosophy: be careful and avoid taking unnecessary risks. On paper, that sounds perfectly reasonable. After all, nobody wants a government that spends recklessly, nobody wants a debt crisis, and nobody wants financial markets to lose confidence in the country. The problem is that there is a difference between avoiding bad investments and avoiding investment altogether. Critics argue that Britain's economic system has gradually become obsessed with managing risk rather than creating growth. When governments propose major infrastructure projects, the first question is often not, how much growth could this create? Instead, it's how much will it cost? And over time, that mindset began shaping the entire economy. You can see this in Britain's constantly changing fiscal rules, with each new government acting as a revolving door of economic targets. In theory, they exist to reassure investors that public finances remain under control. In practice, Britain has spent years changing those rules whenever reality gets in the way. For businesses, this creates a serious problem. Major investments often take years to pay off. These things require confidence that policies will remain stable long enough for the investment to make sense. But if economic priorities keep changing every few years, uncertainty increases. And when uncertainty increases, investment slows. The result is a strange paradox. Britain hasn't built a major reservoir in more than 3 decades. Road and rail projects frequently run over budget. Energy infrastructure faces lengthy approval processes, and major developments often become trapped in endless legal, political, and environmental disputes. Major rail projects have repeatedly faced delays, redesigns, and cancellations. And businesses regularly complain about the slow pace of connecting new developments to transport networks and power grids. None of these problems sound dramatic on their own, but together they create a serious obstacle to growth. Modern economies depend on physical infrastructure. And Britain's workforce is facing problems of its own. More specifically, the people needed to actually keep the economy running. In recent years, millions of people are now out of work due to long-term sickness. Since the pandemic, the number of working-age Britons unable to work because of health conditions has surged to record levels. For older workers, physical health problems remain a major factor. But among younger generations, a different trend has emerged: mental health. Over the last decade, work-limiting mental health conditions among younger adults have risen dramatically. People in their 20s and 30s are reporting health challenges that previous generations typically didn't experience until much later in life. And while the causes remain heavily debated, the economic consequences are becoming harder to ignore. A smaller workforce means fewer people paying taxes, fewer people producing goods and services, and more pressure on public finances. That creates a vicious cycle. Britain's problems are no longer isolated. They're all connected. For years, Britain has struggled to invest enough in its economy. That has contributed to weak productivity growth. Weak productivity has limited wage growth and living standards. Slower growth has left governments with less room to spend. That has made it harder to invest in infrastructure, housing, and public services. Meanwhile, planning restrictions have made it difficult to build the homes and infrastructure the country needs. Health problems have pushed millions of people out of the workforce. And all of this has happened against a backdrop of political uncertainty and short-term decision-making. The result is a cycle. If Britain wants to return to the kind of growth it once enjoyed, it will need more than a single policy change. It will need to break the cycle, because until that happens, the country risks remaining trapped between a successful past and an increasingly uncertain future.